So Joseph became a very important servant in that house. He was the overseer. Whatever happened, he was the one who was very much behind it, making it happen. And you could be very grateful with what God had done with him and for him to bless him. So you have this relationship that all comes from his relationship with God. But you think about how well it did and how it favored him and how it was a blessing to him, but also a blessing to Potiphar. Well, verse 20 is where we'll start. Now, you remember after this was over, she went back home and put back on her widow's garments. Verse 20 says, when Judah sent the kid by his friend the Adullamite to receive the pledge from the woman's hand, he didn't find her. He asked the men of her place, saying, where is the temple prostitute who is by the road of Enaim? But they said, well, there's been no temple prostitute here. Well, so he returned to Judah and said, I didn't find her. And furthermore, the men of the place said, there has been no temple prostitute here. Well, then Judah said, well, let her keep them, lest we become a laughing stock. After all, I sent this kid, but you didn't find her. Now, it was about 3 months later that Judah was informed, your daughter-in-law, Tamar, has played the harlot, and behold, she is also with child by harlotry. Well, now that would have been a great disgrace. And of course, it was a very difficult thing for her. Well, then Judah said, well, bring her out. And he said, and let her be burned. Yeah, he was going to punish her for that. However, it didn't happen that way. It didn't happen that she would be burned because while she was being brought out, that she sent to her father-in-law saying, I am with child by the man to whom these things belong. And she said, please examine and see whose signet ring and cords and staff are these. And Judah recognized them and said, well, she is more righteous than I, inasmuch as I did not give her to my son Shelah, and he did not have relations with her again. Well, here was a situation where she was supposed to belong to Shelah, but he didn't give her to Shelah. And he was, of course, the father of that child. Now, Tamar is somebody that is mentioned not only in the Old Testament. As you open up the New Testament, you remember in the situation dealing with the genealogy of Jesus, that there's a genealogy there, and Tamar's name is mentioned. Look at Matthew chapter 1. And as you go down and you begin to see the various types of things, to Abraham was born Isaac, Isaac to Jacob, Jacob Judah and his brothers. To Judah was born Perez and Zerah by Tamar. You see, Tamar, and of course Judah with Tamar, was in the lineage of Jesus Christ. Yes, this is verse 4, or verse 3 rather, of Matthew chapter 1. So we're told a little bit about this, but we need to know about that aspect of it. And so Genesis 38, even though they never knew anything about, Moses would never know anything about who Jesus was, and many of the things that related to that, knew about Tamar and how that it was in her lineage that there would be one who would be the Lion of the tribe of Judah that would come out. And we'll read about that at a later time. But it came about at the time she was giving birth that, behold, there were twins in her womb. My wife Jackie and I can identify a little bit with that. We did not know we had twins until after the first one was born. And it says, moreover, it took place that while she was giving birth, one put out a hand, and the midwife took and tied a scarlet thread on his hand, saying, this one came out first. But it came about as he drew back his hand that, behold, his brother came out. And then she said, What a breach you have made for yourself. So his name was Perez, meaning breach. Well, and afterward, his brother came out who had the scarlet thread on his hand, and he was named Zerah. Zerah. And of course, that idea is a dawning or brightness is his name. In the book of 2 Samuel, chapter 5, there's a little more information that is helpful to us. Chapter 5 and verse 20. So David came to Baal Perazim and defeated them there. And he said, the Lord has broken through my enemies before me like a breakthrough of waters. And therefore he called that place Baal Perazim. And the name Zerah and some of these other things, the breakthrough is there in that aspect of it, how that there was a breach of the wall. And so very similar to the word Perez, but that's an important thing. But here you have back in this book of Genesis 38, the story of the birth of these twin brothers. Now, we think about Jacob and Esau and how they were twin brothers. Now, Ishmael and of course Isaac were not twins, but certainly there was animosity between brothers, just as there was animosity between Cain and Abel. It seems like there are some brothers that are born and adversity follows after them. But here you have these two who were born, and one of them had a thread around his hand. Then we get into chapter 39. Chapter 39. And here it says, now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. See, we go back. Now from verse 37, we have that little bit about Joseph, and then we have this break telling about Judah. But you have to understand, a lot of period took place, a time took place when we get to 39. And so 38 happened sometime in between the time that Joseph was taken and during this period of time that we're going to read about in chapter 39, before he becomes big in Potiphar's house and favored by God, and then later on goes into prison. But Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an Egyptian officer of Pharaoh, and the captain of the bodyguard, bought him from the Ishmaelites, the Midianites, who had taken him down there. And the Lord was with Joseph. I cannot emphasize how important that idea is. And one of the things that we're going to see is this phrase is how the Lord was with him is repeated again and again in this chapter. And what a wonderful thing to be in the favor of God, to have God with us. You know, we are either having God with us or not with us. And I'm thankful every time we can think about God being with us and all the favor that comes from that. One of my stories that I think of that is so important is a story of Samson. And when Samson, of course, had his hair cut as he was asleep on the knees of Delilah, and a man came and cut the 7 locks of his hair. And Delilah says, Samson, the Philistines are upon you. And he jumps up and he thinks everything's going to be okay and he'll do like he did before. But he did not know, Judges 16 says, he did not know that the Lord had left him. There is a big difference between being with the Lord and not being with the Lord. And so this phrase that we see over and over about Joseph and how God favored him and how God blessed him is not some small matter. It's something to really think about. So verse 2, and the Lord was with Joseph so that he became a successful or a prosperous man. Whatever he put his hand to seemed to work. And he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. Now his master saw that the Lord was with him. You see, it was not just a matter of the Lord being with Joseph. It was noticeable to everyone around him that here was somebody who now knew, because of the Lord's blessing, to make things work. He was successful. He was prosperous. And Potiphar could see that in this young man. Now, let's remember, he's not that old. He's not that old. He's still a very young man. But Potiphar saw something in him that was really amazing. He was a successful man. He was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. As master saw that the Lord was with him, yes, saw that, and how the Lord caused all that he did to prosper in his hand. I've known some people, it just seemed like everything they tried to do, God was always with them and helped them. So Joseph found favor in his sight, that is the sight of Potiphar, and became his personal servant. He was the one that Potiphar relied upon more than anyone else, his personal servant. When he had jobs to do, it was Joseph that he turned to. And he made him overseer over his house, and all that he owned, he put in his charge. So Joseph became a very important servant in that house. He was the overseer. Whatever happened, he was the one who was very much behind it, making it happen. And you could be very grateful with what God had done with him and for him to bless him. So you have this relationship that all comes from his relationship with God. But you think about how well it did and how it favored him and how it was a blessing to him, but also a blessing to Potiphar. Oh my, the next verse came about that from the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all that he owned, not just his house, but also his fields and vineyards, everything. This was a very powerful man and a man of wealth and influence. And Joseph was the one who was in charge of all of the things that he owned. Well, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house on account of Joseph. Now, you remember the blessing that was given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that whoever blesses you, I will bless. Well, Potiphar blessed Joseph in some ways by putting him in charge of things, allowing him to do things. And God blessed Joseph and God blessed Potiphar on the basis of that. Thus, and look at where the source of the blessing comes from. Thus, the Lord's blessing was upon all that he, Potiphar, owned in the house and in the field. Wouldn't you like to have that kind of blessing upon you? That everything you own, everything that you have, that God causes it to prosper and to work the way it's supposed to, that God is with you. Well, this was what it was with Joseph, and it was a great blessing. Verse 6, so he left everything he owned in Joseph's charge, and with him around, he didn't concern himself with anything. In other words, he knew that Joseph was trustworthy. He knew that Joseph would take care of him. He knew that Joseph would bless him. So he didn't worry about anything. Everything that he needed to do, he was willing to do it and leave it in Joseph's hands. And so Joseph, always trying to do the right thing, and of course having God's blessing behind him, it just did. And he didn't worry about anything. Why? Because God was behind it. God was there. And that's what we all need in our lives, for God to be with us and to bless us and help us through every struggle that we have.